Robert E. Lee and Slavery by John M. Taylor. For as long as he had been an army officer, Robert E. Lee had been a slaveholder, for he had inherited several house servants from his mother. At the same time, Lee's boyhood in Alexandria may have insulated him from the hard lot of black field hands. The house slaves with whom he came into contact in plantation society were generally well looked after. As for Mary's parents, both were active in the American Colonization Society, an organization dedicated to resettling free blacks in Africa. While at Fortress Monroe, however, Lee had had a brush with a dark side of slavery, the underlying fear of a slave insurrection that made sleep uneasy for many a wealthy planter. In August 1831, a band of slaves in Southampton County, led by Nat Turner, had instigated the bloodiest slave uprising in American history. In 24 hours, before order was restored by Virginia militia and Army regulars, rioting slaves had killed more than 50 whites. Lee was not involved in the slave roundup, but because Turner was at large for 2 months, the insurrection spread fear and alarm across much of Virginia. Lee, in a letter on August 31st, 1831, assured the Custises that the revolt had been put down and deplored the hysteria found in so much of southern Virginia. Lee is not known ever to have purchased a slave. Most army officers in his day had servants, either slaves or hirelings, but Lee preferred to hire those who served him. When he had set out for Mexico, he had taken a free Irishman rather than a slave. In 1860, in a letter to Rooney Lee from Texas, he regretted he might have to purchase a servant, having found it almost impossible to hire one. After leaving Stratford as a child, Lee had few dealings with slavery until 1857, when his father-in-law died, leaving Lee as principal trustee for his estate. Custis bequeathed Arlington to Mary Lee, his only child, for her lifetime. Thereafter it would go to her oldest son, Custis. Custis Lee's two brothers, Rumi and Rob, were bequeathed 4,000-acre estates in Tidewater, Virginia. Each of Robert and Mary's four daughters was to receive $10,000 in cash, but the Custis will did not indicate the source of this money. Robert E. Lee figured in the will hardly at all. For his services as executor, he was given title to an undeveloped lot in Washington, D.C. Lee's father-in-law had died heavily in debt. The Arlington estate had not turned a profit for years, and at the time of its master's death, it was more run down than Stratford had been in Lee's boyhood. A visitor to Arlington in the early 1850s noted in his diary that the plantation was in a most neglected condition. The house itself, never finished, was hastening to premature decay. For Lee, administering his father-in-law's estate would involve not only 2 years of administrative drudgery, but also exposure to slavery in a form that he had previously been spared. His attempts to restore the manor and to make the estate profitable were complicated by the fact that Arlington was home to between 60 and 70 slaves, many past working age. Those on Custis's two other plantations brought the total number of slaves to nearly 200. According to Custis's will, all were to be emancipated by the end of the 5-year period stipulated for settling the estate. However, word soon spread that the Custis workers were free, and work in the fields came to a virtual halt. Mary Custis wrote to an acquaintance that her father had scarcely been laid to rest when two men were found to be lurking about here, tampering with the servants, and telling them that they had a right to their freedom immediately. Robert acknowledged in a letter to Rooney that he had been obliged to jail 3 male slaves who had run away. Managing Arlington tended to confirm Lee in his attitudes regarding the South's peculiar institution. He was opposed to slavery on both moral and practical grounds, but in common with most Southerners of his day, he could not imagine how blacks could prosper in a free economy. In one of his few extended comments on slavery, he wrote to Mary in 1856: "In this enlightened age there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white than to the black race, and while my sympathies are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong with the former." Writing as a white man at a time when blacks and whites alike led an uncertain, hard-scrabble existence, Lee continued, "The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy." Meanwhile, it was a measure of the growing sectional bitterness that Lee found himself accused of abusing slaves in his charge. In June of 1859, two anonymous letters to the New York Tribune accused Lee of whipping slaves who had attempted to escape from Arlington. No sources were given for these allegations, and it was not unusual for newspapers of the day to print unverified charges if they were consistent with the journal's political orientation. Lee refused to respond to the Tribune. Lee gradually brought order to the Custis estate, supervising badly needed repairs to the roof of the manor. When he was unable to use all the field hands, he rented them out to other plantations. He paid off Custis's debts and had all three farms, Arlington, as well as Rooney's and Robb's near Richmond, in reasonably good order. Proceeds from the farms went into a fund designated for Lee's daughters. Lee used his influence and connections to have his son Custis assigned to engineers' headquarters in Washington so that Custis could help take care of his mother and her home. Lee's problems in administering George Custis's will would in a few years be eclipsed by those involved in organizing the Confederate Army. Nevertheless, in 1861, Custis's slaves were freed in accordance with his will, and even in the midst of war, Lee would be concerned for their welfare. On December 21st, 1861, he wrote to Mary that he would issue free papers to workers on the farms as soon as I can see that they can get a support. Those who wished to remain could do so, but they would have to work. Lee would devote the proceeds of their labor to their future establishment. An impartial observer, reflecting on Lee's role in administering the Custis will, would probably conclude that he carried out his duties in a humane and responsible fashion. Some historians believe otherwise. Quoting a letter in which Lee arranges the hiring out of three plantation workers, Allen Nolan concludes that Lee was personally involved in certain of the unseemly corollaries of the slave system, including trafficking in slaves. And what of Lee's professed desire for gradual emancipation? Nolan contends that there is no evidence to support the acceptance of Lee's self serving characterization of himself as one who had always been in favor of gradual emancipation. This is a curious line of argument, for if Lee was not in favor of gradual emancipation, he must have favored either immediate emancipation, which is unlikely, or perpetual slavery. Most fair minded people will accept Lee's commitment to eventual emancipation at face value, but to one who believes Lee to have been a slave trader with all that the term connotes, any conclusion is possible. Lee's statements on slavery put him among a broad spectrum of enlightened Americans who deplored slavery, but who could see no immediate solution. Abraham Lincoln sought an end to slavery, but had grave doubts as to whether whites and blacks could live harmoniously together. Lee's approach typically had a religious element. Slavery would end when Providence so decreed. For Lee, Providence served two functions. On one hand, it was the great dispenser of gifts, including military victories. but Providence also served as a back burner on which to place problems that defied easy resolution. Thus, how long slavery must endure was known only to a wise and merciful Providence. However stereotypical his views on race, Lee believed that all men were equal before God. In the months immediately after the surrender at Appomattox, Lee, in Richmond, attended services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, as he often had during the war. Although it was not unusual for a white church to have black communicants, segregated seating was then the rule. On this day in Richmond, however, a well dressed black man was one of the first to accept the minister's invitation to come forward and receive communion. As the man reached the communion rail, a murmur passed through the congregation, and the service seemed to freeze in place. Then Lee rose from his pew, walked to the communion rail, and knelt next to the black man. Immediately, the rest of the congregation followed his example. From Arlington, Lee was a concerned observer at the collapse of the Union. The Compromise of 1850 was proving an illusion, in part because of the North's unwillingness to enforce the provision that called for the return of runaway slaves. The opening of Kansas to rival groups of pro slavery and anti slavery settlers led to the establishment of rival territorial governments and to a breakdown in order. In December 1856, Lee was reconciled to James Buchanan's election as president, writing home, I hope he will be able to extinguish fanaticism north and south, cultivate love for the country and Union, and restore harmony between the different sections. At the same time, there were hints that Lee considered the Union a voluntary association. In January 1857, he wrote to an Army colleague, I know no other country than the United States and their Constitution. In retrospect, Lee's use of the plural there is significant. On the morning of October 17, 1857, Lee was in his study at Arlington when a rider clattered up to the house. Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, whom Lee had known since Stuart's years as a cadet at West Point, informed Lee that he was to report to the War Department immediately. Young Stuart had been in Washington when he heard rumors that a mob that included blacks had seized the government armory at Harper's Ferry. Could this be a new slave revolt? When Secretary of War John Floyd decided to send for Lee, Stuart volunteered to act as a courier. Lee left Arlington immediately, not even taking time to put on his uniform. Floyd had proposed that an armed force be sent to Harper's Ferry, and President Buchanan had approved. Lee would be in charge, commanding 2 companies of Marines who were already en route to Harper's Ferry. It was nearly midnight when Lee and Stuart arrived, and no one seemed sure what was going on. Lee was told that a man named Smith and a band of his followers had crossed the railroad bridge from Maryland and seized the arsenal and engine house. By then, they had concentrated in the arsenal and were holding several hostages. Lee decided that he had more than enough Marines to handle the situation. He telegraphed the War Department that additional troops would not be necessary. He then ordered Stuart to approach the arsenal at dawn under a flag of truce and to demand its surrender. If the occupants refused, Stuart was to wave his hat and the Marines would move in. At first light on October 18th, Stuart made his way under a flag of truce to the stone building that housed John Brown, 17 of his followers, and an unknown number of hostages. The door opened a crack to Stuart's knock, and several minutes passed in conversation. Then Stuart stepped back, the door slammed shut, and Stuart signaled to Lee. The Marines swept forward and smashed through the door. 2 insurgents were killed, Brown and the others were captured, and the hostages were freed unharmed. Brown was tried, found guilty, and quickly hanged. But the South was not placated so easily, for Brown's stated intent to spark a slave uprising was viewed as abolitionist rhetoric carried to its logical conclusion. Although no slaves had joined Brown, Southerners remembered a recent bloody slave uprising on Haiti and shuddered. In the words of one pro slavery paper, It was not Brown who was responsible for Harper's Ferry, but radical Northerners such as Joshua Giddings, Garrett Smith, and William Henry Seward. Lee put the episode behind him. If he recognized in John Brown a Christian who was unable to leave slavery to the vagaries of Providence, he left no record of his feelings. The raid, he reported, was the work of a fanatic or a madman. Lee's dismissive tone suggests that he was a poor political prophet. Madman or not, John Brown was on his way to martyrdom in the North, and the abortive insurrection at Harper's Ferry would widen the chasm between the sections.